Hello and welcome back to the Herald Newsletter YouTube channel with me, David Carr, founder and editor, coming to you from downtown Belgrade. In this episode, we're looking at Canada. Normally not a country under the spotlight in geopolitical terms because it's usually so stable and quiet and uneventful. Well, that could be about to change, and in this video, we're going to examine the reasons why. So, Canada. Um, it, it's in many ways not surprising that Canada is sort of detached in many ways geopolitically from the world. And this is because it's so overshadowed by its neighbor to the south, the USA superpower. And it's that proximity to America that means that the Canadian economy is and always has been very bound up with America. It's America that imports most Canadian oil and wheat and other products. And the Canadians don't actually have that many deep water ports that would give them connections, meaningful connections, to other parts of the world, not to the extent that they've got border crossings with the USA. And that makes them very dependent upon America for their economy in many ways. It's always had a reputation for being very stable, very reasonable, very civilized, prosperous country. And I think there's a lot of reasons for this. It may be, well, partly due to its British heritage. And that is still there, of course. King Charles is still the sovereign of Canada, the British King Charles. They're part of the Commonwealth. But also because the Americans didn't want to let anyone threaten Canada, because, of course, that would be a security threat to the USA. But also, Canada's location, much of it is inside the Arctic Circle. It's uninhabitable. And it's very difficult to get to Canada, and Canada doesn't share a border with any country except the USA. So it's really um, completely sort of dependent on the USA in many ways, but they do fiercely protect their own independence. Indeed, a lot of Canadians complain that Canada's only identity is not being America. It's a kind of anti identity. Anyway, on to Justin Trudeau. Now, the Liberals have been in charge of Canada, the Liberal Party, since 2015, and the Prime Minister was the leader of the Liberal Party, Justin Trudeau. However, while he was popular for a while, by the beginning of this year, or the end of last year even, he was so unpopular, indeed so hated, that he couldn't actually walk on the streets without being surrounded by a posse of bodyguards in case angry Canadians tried to tear the shirt off his back. And eventually, this pressure got to him, and he resigned as leader of the Liberal Party in January of this year. Now, that means he still stays as Prime Minister because it works a bit like the British system. The head of whoever is the largest party in the Parliament becomes the Prime Minister automatically. So, although Trudeau was no longer the leader of the Liberal Party, he was still Prime Minister until such time as the Liberals pick a new leader. And they did pick one in March, and that was Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England. And Carney was rather parachuted in. And he was unanimously elected as leader of the Liberal Party. But looking at the wider electoral picture at the time, the Liberals under Trudeau were deeply unpopular. Now, just to show the kind of difficulty that the Liberals were in at the beginning of this year, this is the result of opinion polls in Canada leading up to Christmas 2024. And if you can see, the blue line is the Conservative Party, the red line is the Liberal Party, and they've been about neck and neck and neck. Until it got into December, and then the Liberals just plummeted in popularity, down to 16%, which is staggering. And if you look at the Conservatives, they actually went up but the change wasn't so dramatic. They went from hovering around 35, 36%, 30 to 35%, up to 45%. So there was this real anti-liberal, anti-Trudeau feeling, because the gap between them is 29% in electoral terms. It's huge. So by the beginning of this year, with Trudeau resigning, it looked as if the next general election, which was to be held this year, was going to be a shoo-in for the Conservatives, led by a man called Pierre Poilievre. I keep getting his name wrong, Poilievre. And while a lot of Canadians felt that Poilievre he wasn't a very effective leader, nonetheless, they were so fed up with Trudeau and the Liberals that they were prepared to storm the Conservatives into government with a huge lead. It looked an unassailable lead, but it turned out to be wrong. So there we are at the beginning of the year. The Conservatives under Pierre Poilievre, I'm not sure how his name is pronounced, look to have this unassailable lead. They're a shoo-in for the next election, but it all went wrong for them. And the first thing that went wrong was Trudeau's resignation, because it turned out that it wasn't so much the Liberal Party that was unpopular, but Trudeau himself. And once he stepped back, it seems the party did start to recover a little bit. However, the Conservatives were still way in the lead because there was a lot of Canadians who felt that they wanted change. Bringing in Mark Carney was also boosted them a bit, but it was the intervention of Donald Trump that sealed the deal for not just the Conservatives, but the Liberals.
Canada and the United States, that would really be something. You get rid of that artificially drawn line, and you take a look at what that looks like. And it would also be much better for national security. Don't forget, we basically protect Canada, because Canada and the United States, that would really be something.
Donald Trump proposing, or should that be threatening, to annex Canada and turn it into the 51st state of the USA, to effectively abolish Canada. Well, that caused a complete uproar. And not just in Canada, elsewhere too, but mostly in Canada. And the really funny thing is that the most negative reaction came from the Liberals, not from the Conservatives. In fact, many people criticised the Conservative leader, Pierre Poilievre, that he didn't really respond robustly enough to this, that almost he was in favour of the idea. But the Liberals were dead set against it. And the bizarre thing is that Justin Trudeau, as the leader of the Liberals, declared only a few years ago that Canada was the first post-nation state. In other words, it was not a country anymore. It's just a kind of giant cold airport lounge where anyone can come and be happy or live or whatever. And that's really strange then, that the Liberals should have reacted with such force and such vehemence to the abolition of their country, which is something they've kind of been agreeing to with their own prime minister. But perhaps it's because of the nature of Donald Trump. Anyway, what followed was either the most humiliating and ridiculous political defeat in modern history, or the most remarkable comeback in political history, because this revived the Liberal vote. It brought the Liberal voters back out in huge numbers. And it was Trump that did that, not the other issues. And then suddenly the polls started to swing round. The massive advantage that the Conservatives had back at Christmas evaporated. And the election in April, I think it might have been early May, I'll check the date, turned out was going to be a close thing. But with Mark Carney, the new Canadian Prime Minister, leading the Liberals, and with the intervention by Donald Trump, the Conservative lead just evaporated, and the Liberals won a third term in office under Mark Carney. It wasn't an outright victory. They will have to form a coalition, but that's usually the case in Canada with a PR system. But what a humiliating defeat for the Conservatives. And even worse, Pierre Poilievre lost his own seat. He couldn't even get elected in his own seat. They call it a riding in Canada. So that was the result, largely of Donald Trump. And anybody who thinks different, that it was other causes, we're going to look at a graphic that shows why it was Donald Trump that swung it for the Liberals. Just look at this graph, most important factors when deciding vote. And this is from the last election, which I've just checked was on April the 28th. And look at the age ranges, 18 to 29, 30 to 44, 45 to 59, 60 and over. Now, for the 60 and over demographic, known as the boomers, look at what the most important issue was: dealing with Donald Trump. By comparison, reducing your cost of living was down at 38%, making housing more affordable under 10%, improving Canada's healthcare system 26, 27%, growing the economy 15 or 14%, making Canada a better place to live about 5%. So for the boomer cohort of Canada, and it's the biggest voting bloc, the most important issue in the election was dealing with Donald Trump. That mattered to them more than making Canada a better place to live, more than healthcare, more than growing the economy, more than reducing the cost of living. It's really quite sobering to see that there was that much anti-Trump feeling, and almost certainly that's what swung the election for the Liberals. So the Liberals were back in power. Mark Carney was confirmed as Prime Minister. But all is not well, and the key to it is looking at this map of Canada with its various provinces. Now, Canada's a federal system, not like the USA, a bit more like Australia. And the various states are sort of semi-autonomous. And you can see here in the east, there's Ontario and Quebec. And Ontario is the most liberal state of Canada. But if we go out to the west here, we see Alberta and the Northwest Territories, British Columbia, Saskatchewan, Manitoba. And the west of Canada is far more conservative. In fact, they did vote majority Conservative, but they were outweighed by the votes in the east, where the majority of the population are. However, it's important, this map is important, because Alberta is where Canada's oil and gas comes from. It's the oil and gas state. It's the kind of treasure trove of Canada. And together with Saskatchewan and Manitoba, they're known as the prairie states. And it's always been much more conservative leaning. And there's a lot of discomfort there now because they feel that they don't really have representation in the federal government. And this has caused some problems. And I think the collapse of the Conservative Party has aggravated those problems. But there's another factor as well. Okay, now this is a map of Canada's provinces, but with the equalisation payments marked out. And what are these? Well, the wealth that's generated by each province is sort of redistributed by the central government. And you can see here that the bulk of it goes to Quebec, $13.6 billion. Some of it goes to Ontario, $546 million. and some of it to that's Manitoba, 4.7 billion, and a little bit here. I think that's Nova Scotia, and some of the eastern states get some as well, and 3.5 billion here. I think is that Prince Edward Island. It might well be. Um, but the bulk of that wealth is generated by Alberta, but Alberta doesn't see a penny of it. Alberta's in blue there. Instead, this money is funneled east to the eastern states, which are the more liberal states, and primarily to Quebec. Now, why Quebec? Well, Quebec is the French speaking part of Canada, and they've been threatening to secede from Canada for decades. And these equalization payments are essentially bribes, they're sops to keep Quebec from seceding. It's a kind of, stay in Canada and we'll give you more money. It's an outright bribe. And that money is primarily paid for by Alberta. And this has got a lot of Albertans very frustrated because they can't change the federal government equalisation payments, and yet they're paying them. And the other source of discontent in Alberta is the fact that they want to explore more of their oil and gas opportunities, and they're prevented from doing so by environmental laws passed in the capital, Ottawa, and over which they have very little say. So a lot of Albertans feel that they're getting a raw deal from Canada. And when Donald Trump proposed making Canada the 51st state, the Albertans were not against this idea to the extent that everybody else in Canada was. And that leads us on to the issue that could cause major problems for Canada and could be a big boost for the USA. So the Albertans are restless. They think they're being exploited and abused and underappreciated. At least there's a substantial number of people in Alberta who think that. And the Canadian provinces all have their own premier. Um, the Albertan premier is a woman called Danielle Smith. This is her, looking a bit grumpy here. And she's very popular in Alberta, apparently, I'm told, and she is very much a conservative. She was very opposed to Trudeau and a political opponent as well of Mark Carney. And it's Danielle Smith that has been making some noises about calling a referendum in Alberta on independence. In fact, the Albertan government, if that's the right word, has even gone as far as to change the law to make referenda, which is the proper term, plurals for referendum, a little bit easier to do. Just look at this headline. It's from a Canadian broadcasting company, CBC. Alberta is changing the rules to make referendums, that's actually wrong, it should be referenda, easier. Here's how. Lower thresholds will also affect citizen initiatives, recalls. And this is from May the 14th. So this was just a couple of weeks after the election. They've, in fact, Danielle Smith has lowered the bar for a referendum. And that opens the way to a referendum being held, I believe, next year in 2026. And that could produce an interesting result. So things are quite delicately balanced in Canada. And really, at this stage, it's all speculation. Just because there can be a referendum next year doesn't mean there will be a referendum next year. And even if there is a referendum, it may not produce a result in favour of secession. It may vote in favour of staying in the Canadian Federation. But if the discontent grows, and Mark Carney's going to need to address that discontent, then what if there is a referendum, and what if the Albertans do vote to secede from Canada? What then? Would Saskatchewan and maybe Manitoba join them? Because they've all got similar gripes against the federal government in Ottawa. If that did happen, would they then appeal to Donald Trump? Or would Donald Trump then take the opportunity to offer them American statehood and thereby American protection? And there's not much Canada could do about it in those circumstances. What would happen if that occurs and Alberta and maybe Saskatchewan become states of America, and then all of Alberta's oil and gas and mineral wealth is going to the USA, and there's no transfer payments to make to Quebec? If Quebec is no longer being bribed with money, would Quebecans then announce that they're going to secede from Canada as well? Would they be out of the picture? And if so, we could see Canada just disintegrate and cease to exist as a nation. It seems very strange to say it after being so many decades as an extreme, decades, maybe even hundreds of years, as a very stable entity. But we live in strange times. How likely is all of this? Who can say? Maybe not at all. But on the other hand, in 5 years' time, we could be looking at a very different political map of North America. Okay, that's it for this particular video. There's a link in the description below to the Herald newsletter. Please subscribe, it's free, and join our mailing list and get regular email updates to your inbox about all matters of geopolitics. And also, please subscribe and hit the notification bell and like this video, because that helps me with the YouTube algorithm, and it helps me and encourages me to make more videos for you, which is what I want to do. In the meantime, thanks for listening, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.